For decades, people have been trying to pinpoint the exact moment in which certain shows fell off or died. But more often than not, they tend to go for the same obvious examples, citing moments where a major character is changed, added, or leaves, a finale that disappoints. And sometimes, it's a regular episode that is just so bad that fans can't look past it no matter how much time goes by. But I think that's a little too easy. Because to me, a lot of episodes that I would argue killed a show, to use extreme language, are not necessarily the worst the series has to offer. Sometimes these episodes aren't even bad at all. It can be an episode that you genuinely enjoy, but it shows a shift in how the series thinks about itself, and therefore a shift in how you view it from that point onwards. It can be the moment a show loses an integral part of itself, either done through a writer or directorial change, or a show consistently pushing the boundaries of what it can be, exploring other avenues of storytelling or places to take their characters, whether or not they were ready for it. Take The Simpsons, for example. When you ask people when the show died, the answer that you typically get is Season 9's The Principal and the Pauper. And sure, that episode is weird. It's a dumb retcon that changes our understanding of Skinner as a character for the sake of such an overused trope.
You're not Seymour Skinner. Skinner? Skinner? I'm Skinner.
People complain about it for a reason, but maybe a little too much. Because even though it pushes the boundaries of what the show was ever willing to explore before this point, I'd argue that, on its own, it still feels like an episode of The Simpsons. It's still a story with the characters you know and love, aside from the premise nothing else feels that out of place, and most importantly, still very funny.
Thank you. I must say, in many ways, Springfield really beats the old slave labor camp.
You know, in a vacuum, I like this episode. The hatred mostly stemming from hardcore fans' feelings of betrayal, that at any point the series could completely pull the rug out from under you, and reveal this character you've spent 9 seasons growing attached to has been living a lie. This wound up being so controversial that even the crew of The Simpsons themselves had to acknowledge that it was a misfire.
We'll just call you Snowball too, and pretend this whole thing never happened.
That's really a cheat, isn't it?
I guess you're right, Principal Tamzarian.
Even if the guy who wrote the thing still stands by his decisions, calling it the best episode of television I feel I ever wrote, which, yeah, dude, seems like you're alone in that opinion. See, to me, the most interesting turning point in that show comes way later, and I mean way later. That being Bart's birthday. And I say this as someone who likes this episode. To me, it doesn't kill the show because it's bad, but because it removes any illusion that the show will ever meaningfully end. This was the season 36 premiere, although it's framed as the series finale, with all the celebrity guest stars from over the years gathering together to watch the final episode of The Simpsons, written entirely by AI. It's a solid premise, and there's a lot to enjoy about it, especially the few shots they animated to look like they came from the early seasons. And funnily enough, this one also makes a reference to Principal and the Pauper, so I guess it's fitting.
Real son.
More change!
Now, my reason for claiming this to be the episode that killed the show, again using that term very loosely, is more so in how overtly it tells the audience to not have any expectations for how the series will end, whenever that may be. Every character gets their most absolute picture-perfect outcome. We see Mr. Burns die and the power plant close. All the employees becoming millionaires. Skinner quits his job as principal. Homer has learned how to overcome his temper. All as Bart finally turns 11. It's basically a Simpsons version of that one YouTube comment that's coming up with their perfect SpongeBob finale where every character gets their most fairy tale outcome imaginable. The most obvious difference here, though, is that The Simpsons is not SpongeBob. It is more than a series that exists to be goofy and comedic. The unfortunate circumstance the show has found itself in is that people do care about these characters dearly, and would like to see them get some sort of meaningful send-off, although of course not to this much of an extent. And so here's an episode that comes out and finally says, get that idea out of your head because it's not coming. Showrunner Al Jean coming out after the episode release to confirm that if there were to be a finale of the show, that it would pretty much just be a regular episode. Now, I agree or disagree with that sentiment. I can understand both responses to this, but for me, personally, I can't help but feel as if this comes off like an admission of defeat, that there is nothing they could do to send off the show in a way that satisfies everyone, and because of that, they don't even want to try. So we're now left with an episode that isn't a story about The Simpsons as a family, it's a story about The Simpsons as a show. And they've done a few meta episodes throughout the series that don't necessarily break the fourth wall, like Homer's Enemy, which highlights the absurdity of this character, deconstructing the formula of the show, and the shield he gets from any and all consequence, being the main character. There's even a later episode that does the opposite, where a new power plant worker comes in and loves Homer because of his amazing accomplishments. They've even done episodes equally meta to Bart's birthday. My mind jumps to the spin-off showcase, giving us a few what-if scenarios poking fun at spin-offs, or the 130th episode spectacular, which gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the show's history.
The Simpsons began as the brainchild of cartoonist Matt Groening.
But the difference, at least to me, is that they're playing with ideas that don't actually affect the show's reality. The Simpsons is not getting a spin-off anytime soon, and a behind-the-scenes parody, is a different thing altogether. But Bart's birthday is directly acknowledging something that will eventually come. The Simpsons will someday have a finale, before it's revived on Hulu 5 years later, I guess. And for the show to make an episode that flat out says you have nothing to look forward to when that day comes, it's a little disappointing. And that's what makes this topic fascinating to me. An episode like this is not a failure, not a catastrophe, but it marks the moment where the show stops pretending it's anything more than what it is. A product designed to go on forever. Again, it no longer feels like a show about The Simpsons, but a show about The Simpsons. Trademark. Sometimes the episode's just fucking bad, though. Game of Thrones is quite possibly the most extreme case of a show's final season completely killing any and all hype it had built up for years. And that's not to say nobody was satisfied with it. Honestly, I think the average person just kind of took these shows for what they are, and don't bother looking into things with any kind of critical eye. At least, that's the impression I get talking to my dad about this kind of stuff. He loved the Game of Thrones finale. I can't take that away from him. But anyways, while that whole last season is criticized for a variety of reasons, one including the crew accidentally leaving a coffee cup on set during a scene, I think a common turning point for a lot of fans came with Season 8's The Long Night. For some context, this was the episode where the show was about to resolve one of its biggest storylines, the fight against the Night King and his army of the dead. For 8 long, coffee cupless seasons, the White Walkers have been this looming threat, something the creators feared and the audience obsessed over. It was finally time for the payoff. Fans were expecting something tense, something scary, a monumental moment. And instead, a lot left feeling incredibly underwhelmed. The Night King is defeated in an abrupt moment that, while was surprising, didn't feel satisfying considering how much of a threat they've been. And for people paying attention to the story, some of the strategies the characters used just didn't make any sense. For fans who had invested years into looking into every little bit of foreshadowing, every prophecy, every minor detail, it was a huge letdown. No, not everyone hated it. Again, shoutouts to my dad. Some really enjoyed the episode and loved the sheer spectacle of it all. It was so exciting that it disguised any plot contrivances or character choices that didn't make complete sense, and that's fair. But for a lot of viewers, this was the exact point where the hype started to collapse, because it signaled that the show was not guaranteed to meet the expectations it had set for itself. One episode undoing years of setup and world building. Again, at least for a large portion of the audience. Maybe if the rest of the season had done more to rectify this, The Long Night could have been forgiven by those people. A slight dip in an otherwise great final season, but no. It ended on a run so loathed that it significantly damaged its reputation among fans, going down in history as another great show with a really bad final season. There's more than you'd think. Lost is one that used to be the butt of these jokes for the longest time, although the reputation of it has seen a big uptick in defenders over the last few years, one of those defenders being me. I love the final season of Lost, especially the last episode, but I can't say I don't see why people had grown so sick of it by that point. A lot of viewers were just tuning in every week to finally find out what the damn point of the island was, waiting for this mystery to finally be unlocked. And while those answers were eventually given, the show seemed a lot more focused on the characters instead. I think by this point, a large chunk of the viewer base had grown tired of the constant cat and mouse chase. All setup and little payoff. And while that can be attributed to factors outside of the writer's control, such as ABC forcing them to extend their story out for 6 seasons instead of the planned 3, it doesn't mean that episodes like Season 3's Stranger in a Strange Land only add to the fears of the show meandering, trying to give deeper meaning to everything without knowing whether or not any of it actually adds to the story. Here, while 2 of our main characters are paddling back to the island after having been kidnapped, and argue about whether or not they should go back for our lead, Jack, who was left behind, we flash back to a time in which Jack traveled to Thailand shortly after his divorce, meeting a woman he likes and us finally getting the answer to the question that has plagued the series from the very beginning. Where did Jack get his tattoos? It's an episode I always loathe getting to, not even because it's necessarily bad on its own, but because it just feels kinda pointless, answering questions to a mystery that nobody gave a shit about. It showed viewers that the series would be more than willing to waste your time by dangling that carrot further and further away, and then slapping you in the face. This episode did one thing though, and it was be so negatively received by pretty much everyone that it, at least partially, convinced ABC to let them end the show. So I really can't be that mad at it. Lost is great, go watch it. And these are just a couple examples of what can go wrong with long-running shows. And each of these three cases can be boiled down to one thing: raised expectations. It wouldn't be as disheartening to learn The Simpsons had no intentions of giving their characters any kind of meaningful send-off, if the show hadn't been such a prominent part of the entertainment landscape for almost 4 decades. And to have it confirmed that they're now seen as mere glorified mascots, it's a little sad. The release of Game of Thrones was monumental, reshaping the television landscape forever, showing that you could put out a series that rivaled the scale and cinematic qualities of the biggest blockbusters of the time. So the fact that not even a show that big could stick the landing kinda set the blueprint for how not to end a series going forward. And Lost did a similar thing, although its more controversial episodes definitely created more of a split between those who were invested in the mystery and who were invested in these characters, like I said. The show's troubled production caused it to flip-flop between each, never knowing which direction to lean more into until its final season. And as a result of that, half loved it and considered it to be one of the greatest series ever produced, while others believe it to be one of the most disappointing shows of all time. These are pretty tame examples though. Again, at least one of these episodes I actually like. How about shows that do damage completely beyond repair? What about the shows that suffer from a fundamental structural change that they never manage to recover from? Well, I have a couple examples, but none more devastating than what happened to 2.5 Men. I haven't seen much of this show. I tended to watch it for an hour or two before South Park would come on Comedy Central, but my experiences do not do justice to how huge this series was. While relatively forgotten nowadays, there was a point where this show was pulling in well over 10 million viewers an episode, making it star Charlie Sheen one of the highest paid actors on TV, raking in almost $2 million an episode during its prime. This was the peak of dude humor. People liked its raunchiness filled with sex jokes and hedonistic protagonists, as two brothers lived together in their dysfunctional Malibu beach house. There was just one issue: Charlie Sheen got fired during season 8. The show went on till season 12. There is way too much to get into when it comes to the endless controversy Charlie Sheen found himself in during the early 2010s. Drugs, yeah, that's pretty much it. But it resulted in him being kicked off the show after a very public fallout with creator Chuck Lorre, same guy who made Big Bang Theory, by the way, and Baby Sheldon. So what was the show to do? Charlie was more than a lead. He defined the tone of the series, its humor, pacing, identity, all built around his cynical and unserious persona. The dynamic between Charlie, Alan, and Jake was the show, how everyone balances out the chaos he creates. And so they decided to replace him with Ashton Kutcher, a tech billionaire who buys Charlie's house after he dies. Talk about a complete 180. The issue isn't that it's Ashton Kutcher. I unironically love Butterfly Effect. But doing something this drastically different would fundamentally change any show it happened to. His character, Walden, was written as way more naive and far less cynical, which on its own isn't a problem, but it completely alters the framework of the series and therefore how every other character operates. For example, Ellen no longer has his foil. His neurotic behavior worked best when contrasted with Charlie's recklessness. And so without that, his character had to become more exaggerated to make up for this loss. It's like the energy that Charlie so effortlessly brought now had to be spread out amongst the rest of the cast to try and find a new anchor. But what you're left with is just a bunch of kooky, crazy characters, none of which balance the other out. The show's tone shifted. What was once driven by sharp, character-based conflict had now become something so much less defined. And it's not like the writing or acting or directing got worse, it just came off like nobody knew what this show was even in service of anymore. You know, everything is pretty much the same, except the main character is now dead, leaving everyone else to occasionally bring him up like a ghost whose presence still looms over. This is, of course, the risk with long-running shows that hinge on a specific dynamic. Once one element is gone, you're left to either end the thing or rebuild from the ground up, and 2.5 Men couldn't really pick either. The half-man soon left after his religious beliefs made him not approve of the show's content anymore. They brought in a girl for a season to act as Charlie's long-lost daughter. Then they got rid of her and had a finale where we find out that Charlie has actually been alive the entire time and now plans on killing every main character, before having a piano dropped on his head.
Winning.
This is really how the show ends. Please go watch this video, it is insane. 2.5 Men was too big to end, with or without its most crucial aspect. And so it spent its last few seasons scrambling to find something that stuck, before finally accepting that there was no winning, pun intended. And so while there are a lot of episodes I'm sure are worse than the death of Charlie and the introduction of Walden, but I don't think there's any denying this is where the show marked its death. Fairly OddParents, time for a complete tonal shift, actually shares a lot in common with 2.5 Men, at least when it comes to how they handled their last couple seasons, except instead of Timmy dying, we got a rude, toot, hip-happening talking dog. This show is like the prime example of how introducing new characters can demolish the focus of a series, although I disagree with the usual consensus of which character this was. Most fans point to the Fairly Odd Baby, which was coincidentally the most watched episode in the entire show upon premiere. This special opens up Season 6 by introducing Poof, the child to Cosmo and Wanda. Now, a show getting so desperate that they have to introduce a baby is like an industry joke, right? Out of ideas, add a baby. And to many, that's how Poof's introduction was seen. A lame attempt to boost ratings, which it was. But I really don't think Poof adds enough to the show to be detrimental to its overall quality or tone. If anything, he only serves to bolster the marriage between Cosmo and Wanda, and further pushes what the show is all about, putting Timmy through a series of wild and crazy situations that help him be a better person. A baby he's got to help look after is like the ultimate test of that. Now he's got to learn to be the positive influence. I like it. All Poof really did was bring in the opportunity for some new baby-centric episodes. Certainly wasn't the takeover most people presented it as at the time. The show continued to function the same way. Timmy makes a wish, has to find a way to solve it. There's just 3 flying creatures now instead of 2. What a shakeup. Others would point to the show's final season premiere, which saw us be introduced to Chloe Carmichael, this super-duper popular girl who everybody loves, yet for some reason needs fairy godparents because sometimes she annoys people. Also, she has to share Cosmo and Wanda with Timmy because get fucked. The show had now come full circle, a complete parody of what it once mocked.
They're my best friends. I happen to like them.
Our research clearly shows your fans don't. Now meet your wacky new sidekicks.
But I think that show had long lost the plot by that point. To me, I'll always believe the episode that killed the Fairly OddParents to be the Season 7 premiere, Anti-Poof. For every fairy, there's an anti-fairy, and so with the birth of Poof, and a lot of uncomfortable shots of a pregnant anti-Wanda, we're introduced to Foop, a character who would proceed to completely take over the show. Again, on its own, it's a fine episode, I guess, but to me, marks the death of the Fairly OddParents for good. Every single villain previously established in this show, aside from Crocker, were next to completely abandoned in favor of making Foop the show's central antagonist, because it's a baby, and he's evil! That's the whole character. He bloody takes over the show. For example, Vicky, arguably the show's main antagonist, in the intro to every single episode, gets completely sidelined. And the show makes the bizarre choice to team up Foop with Crocker to become the new bad guys throughout the rest of the show. The Pixies? Gone. Foop's own parents? Totally abandoned. Never seen again after she shits him out. And his character is just that he's Stewie Griffin, but without any of the depth or width that made him an animated icon. Foop is evil because he's evil, leaving most episodes with him to rely on the same hero versus villain trope that they would drive into the ground. Foop is given just as much relevance as Crocker, a Day 1 OG, when his character is about as deep as their fucking lame-ass Darth Vader parody. They knew only to give that guy like 6 episodes, because that's all he needed. After a while, so many episodes just stop being about Timmy. Instead, the focus will be all about Crocker or Foop or Crocker and Foop, as they try and hopelessly defeat Timmy, who is just minding his own business. While the show still does keep up its shtick of episodes centered around the chaos Timmy's wishes creates, you can just feel the writer's desire to put the attention back on Crocker and Foop. So much so that they made an entire special that is so obviously a backdoor pilot to a Poof and Foop spin-off, where they go to Spell-Elementary School together. Sure, yeah, whatever. I mean, this is clearly the show you guys want to write. To me, Foop just marks the point in which the Fairly OddParents gives up. 90% of the folks who had a hand in making it what it once was are gone. The new guys clearly have their priorities set elsewhere, and creator Butch Hartman now has the ultimate trick up his sleeve anytime his ratings drop. You're gonna cancel us? Well, how about a dog? Now there's an anti-dog. Let's bring in a little girl. Let's take Timmy's teacher, clone him, and make him a kid to be friends with Timmy now. That show is a nightmare in those last few seasons, but you have more than enough of that on this channel you can sift through. These two shows demonstrate how greatly a series' identity lies in the balance of all its elements. And by removing or overemphasizing any central figure, whether it be a new lead character or overly dominant antagonist, it can gradually, or not so gradually, change the tone, pacing, and structure in a way that makes it feel entirely different. Doesn't matter if the framework stays intact, the audience notices the shift, and the result are shows that carry the same name and format, and that's all. There are other examples of this, with a pair of British shows like Skins and Peep Show. Skins had a unique gimmick where every 2 years the cast would be switched out with a series of new kids who either felt like cheap imitations of who came before, or failed to grab me the same way that initial group did, whereas Peep Show decided to give the main character everything he had ever wanted from the beginning, only to go back on it and drop him at square one again because, well, we need another season. Again, these are examples of series that lose a piece of themselves. But what about shows that feel like they're only building? Season after season of character growth and evolution, only to undo all of that in a single moment that completely turns off the audience. Well, I have two examples of this I want to discuss, and funnily enough, they're both Cartoon Network shows. First up is Regular Show, easily one of the most successful cartoons of the last 2 decades, starring 2 slacker park employees Mordecai and Rigby, as they try and get themselves into or out of typical mundane situations through methods that wind up unleashing chaos on the place. Ruin the hot dogs for the park barbecue, enlist the help of sentient sausages who end up wanting to eat people, that sort of stuff. One of the reasons, aside from the humor, that I think contributed to the show's appeal, especially to a slightly older demographic,
Hey, where's this secret?
We're just headed up to the campgrounds.
Oh, Pine Ridge or Valley Fields?
Yeah.
was the ways in which the series kept continuity between episodes. For the most part, each segment can be watched and enjoyed as its own thing, but viewers are rewarded for having seen it all in order, whether it be through returning characters or dynamics changing over time. Some people who've seen my Regular Show ranking may think I'm about to discuss the introduction of Thomas, a character who was added to the main cast for seemingly no reason, who contributes almost nothing to the episodes he appears in, only for him to way later be exposed as a Russian spy. Yeah, that was fucking lame, but there's a much more infamous moment to talk about, and I'm sure most of you know what that is. The Season 6 finale dumped at the altar. So, a bit of context before getting into the actual moment where things go downhill. At the start of the series, we learn that Mordecai has a crush on the coffee shop waitress Margaret, many episodes in those first few seasons revolving around his desperate attempts to get with her, which she is always shown to be either oblivious or ignorant to.
I'm not seeing anyone right now. Guys are jerks.
God, I know, right? Guys are the worst.
And while this is initially presented as nothing more than your typical hopeless crush that never pays off and resets every episode, we saw the writers actually take things one step further by having them both get together in Season 4. Now they're a couple, and we get a good few episodes of them being together. Until later in that season where Margaret goes to college and they break up. They spend a bit showing Mordecai taking the breakup hard, trying to find any excuse to go see her before deciding it's time to let her go. And it's with that, in Season 5, where he runs into an old flame, CJ. Now, Mordecai had already fumbled her by this point in the show, as she's introduced in a single episode during Season 3 as a much more fitting partner for him. They have the same interests, get along well, and is voiced by Linda Cardellini, what's not to love? Well, despite her having feelings for him, Mordecai feels to pick up on them, and so when the chance to get with Margaret once again arises, he completely fucks over CJ by inviting her out on a date which she had assumed was just between them. After he calms her down, CJ refuses to be his friend and leaves, not to be seen again until 2 seasons later where they try and reconnect. I always liked that CJ was a character who could take part in the chaos of the show, as seen in future episodes featuring her. Margaret, on the other hand, always felt so disconnected from it, Mordecai typically trying to prevent her from getting caught up in whatever they got going on. Fans of the show loved CJ, and more importantly, loved Mordecai and CJ, especially after feeling as if the chasing after Margaret shtick had gotten old. You know, once they actually got in a relationship, it became pretty clear that these two characters don't really mesh that well. At least not enough to believe this would be Mordecai's, I don't know, future wife or whatever. So great. Margaret is written out of the show, he's in a happy, healthy relationship with CJ. Wow, you know, in a way, it really feels like the show is maturing and moving on to be. Then Margaret returns and Mordecai makes out with her, while CJ watches.
No, it's not.
CJ, wait!
Awkward.
Obviously, they're trying to play with this idea that Mordecai doesn't truly know what he wants, that there's a part of him that can't set aside the history he has with Margaret. And I do really like that, but once CJ later forgives him for this, that's really where it should have ended. The show needs to move on. Mordecai stumbled when confronted with his past, but he got out of it. That's the end. But instead, the show chooses to continue dwelling on this awkwardness, which, again, it's not an inherently bad idea. In fact, I do enjoy how real a lot of these plots can get, like CJ feeling bad that all this has gotten in the way of Eileen and Margaret's friendship. But then, it just keeps going. This show that was once about two losers trying to make the most out of their dead-end lives has turned into a near-constant soap opera, and things only got worse and dumped at the altar. At this point, we've seen at least 5 episodes where Mordecai is put through a series of wacky situations that make CJ feel as if he still has feelings for Margaret, including one where she lies about having a boyfriend as an excuse to hang out with him without upsetting her, where she then admits that she still has feelings for him, and now it's Muscle Man's wedding and both CJ and Margaret are gonna be there. And after a lot of thinking about what he truly wants, Mordecai decides to interrupt his friend's wedding, keep the microphone, and announce that he doesn't know who his soulmate is. And before he can get the chance to break up with her again, in front of everyone, CJ leaves crying. I don't even think the idea behind this moment is bad. I like it in theory, but in execution, the only way they could make it work on this scale was by making Mordecai come off like an unself-aware moron. And no amount of, ugh, I'm bad at romance speeches can fix that. It permanently affected how people talk about him as a character. Like, this is the moment he is known for, even with those who don't watch the show, as well as making Rigby, the far more reckless and idiotic character, come off like the way more reasonable guy. What's worse is that it amounted to nothing. All of this only for Mordecai and Margaret to agree to just be friends from here on. There's an implication that they'll get married and be happy in the future, but the finale shows otherwise. Him ending up with this Batgirl who we've never met before, only to know that in the end, none of it matters. The park then goes into lockdown, blocking the main cast off from the rest of the world, and then they're shot off into space for the entire final 30 episodes. So much development and maturing, only for the show to undo all of it in one single scene and move on to something entirely different for the rest of its run. A moment that does this exact same thing on a much larger scale comes from Adventure Time, even if the moment has been somewhat redeemed in the eyes of the fandom all these years later. No, I have not seen anything from Adventure Time past the first 2 seasons, and so I wouldn't feel entirely confident talking about this moment myself, especially considering how much the series built up to it, and so I've brought on Sarcastic Chorus to talk about it for me. Take it away.
So, look, there's a lot of Adventure Time. It's the kind of show that looks like it was made for children and stoners, with commercials that did it no favors if you were older than 10. But in hindsight, we realized this was kind of cute, and the show was actually peak.
Mrs. Cow, take that bag off your udder. You're a beautiful girl, so why don't you just let it hang out? Yo, put that bag back on!
So if we're talking about episodes that killed or changed Adventure Time, then it comes down to, like, dealer's choice, and really what corners of the fandom you're running with. My personal assassin would be Frost and Fire, not because it broke up Finn and Flame Princess, but because it broke them up in what child me could only describe as the dumbest... Wait, Mark, can I swear?
Sure, I don't care.
This seemed like the dumbest, most forced shit imaginable, as it really took the relationship that freed us from 3 seasons of a boy pining for a 600-year-old woman, and broke them up over an owl and a wet dream, which annoyed just about everybody, as it felt like a choice made by the writers instead of the characters. But after seeing what they did with it, I feel like everyone has really come to love this episode and the breakup, as it ushered in an era of Finn maturing and coming to understand himself, realizing why what he did was a mistake. And after this point, Adventure Time would revel in this melancholy absurdism in a way that only Adventure Time could. However, if I were to talk about one of the other big contenders for what caused the fandom to have a massive fit, it's not the episode where the Lich shows up. It's not the one where we found out Jake raw dogged a horse. No, it's Breezy. See, the reason that this episode was a breaking point for the fandom, that we would eventually switch up on later, is that at this point in the timeline, Adventure Time had been going on for like 6 seasons. We had been watching this show for 4 years, and it still felt like the same shenanigan-filled show. See, this is something that I've really come to adore about Adventure Time, is that this show does not have a narrative second gear like a lot of other cartoons. If you've watched enough cartoons, you know what I'm talking about, where you get that first season of all shenanigans, only for the second season to hit, and suddenly we are focusing on the plot. But Adventure Time never did that. It never loses its whimsy or feels like it's forcing itself to be a different kind of story, even though the fans were fucking fiending for it at the time. See, 6 seasons in, and we were still watching Finn do about the same shit he would have done in season 1. So for the fans that were still around, the idea that Adventure Time should evolve was a common idea, with the finale of season 5 giving us what easily could have been the jumping off point to a much grander story. Finn met his dad, found out he was a dick, and would rather escape with eldritch monsters than be with his son, with Finn trying to stop the breakout, ending with him losing his arm, and also failing, leaving Finn fatherless for the 3rd time in his life, and having to live with the fact that Daddy didn't want him. This was a massive holy shit moment, and was considered a long time coming by the fans, as for the entire run of this show, it was constantly foreshadowing that Finn was gonna lose his arm one of these days. And after that finale, the fandom was rabid at the idea that things were gonna get more serious, except that doesn't happen, because instead we got Breezy, where Finn is depressed, becomes a fuckboy, and his arm grows back. Now, the plot of Breezy is actually more complicated than that. It's pretty much a story about Finn getting deflowered, battles his depression by kissing princesses with his new wing woman, who falls in love with him and then changes herself by eating jelly to save his life, only for him to tell her he isn't into her like that, and wants to keep things casual even though she just did the B equivalent of giving up her virginity. Yeah, like, this episode is a lot. See, the thing about Breezy is that at the time, it was seen by some as a show walking back on potential storylines, leaving people mad that after years of hints, Finn just got his arm back, with the show going back to business as usual, dashing the hopes of many, not to mention how fans think LSP did things in this episode that should have landed her in prison. Breezy is interesting, in that it forced fans to accept what Adventure Time wanted to be, versus what we thought it could be. Yes, it was giving, this is a very special episode. Yes, it seemed to walk back things, but as we would discover later, it was all set up for a much more interesting payoff down the road. But the street still rioted, but in hindsight, the thing that makes Adventure Time amazing is how the story becomes deeper instead of bigger. The status quo barely changes, but our understanding of the characters shifts dramatically. This show is a fine wine that only got better with age, as we look back and realize all the complicated ideas and topics it wanted to talk about, and did so in a way only Adventure Time could. While Breezy is disliked in some corners to this day, mainly because of the lump, I personally have come to adore it, and how it marks another shift in Finn's long journey to figuring out who he is. And at the end of the day, and to just be fully corny, this was an adventure that's gonna stick with me for a lifetime. Also, Mark, how the fuck have you only seen up to season 2?
These are single moments that caused audiences to feel as if the show is going backwards, rather than looking ahead and continuing to grow. But what about the exact opposite instance? Where the series delivers an episode so monumental that it results in viewers leaving out of a feeling that this one moment could never be topped. Well, recently I've been watching Twin Peaks, the original series, and boy, I was invested. After powering through the quite boring movie-length pilot, I quickly got hooked, the entire show revolving around the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer. Created by the acclaimed David Lynch, R.I.P., the show did an excellent job at slowly feeding you more and more information about everyone who lived in the small town of Twin Peaks, from the parents to the teens to the sheriffs, as FBI agent Dale Cooper is sent in after noticing similarities between another murder that happened elsewhere. It is a very weird show, again, David Lynch, and while for the most part the first season remained relatively dark and grounded, the second completely dives headfirst into the surreal, and it kinda lost me. Not entirely, I was still invested and wanted to find out who amongst our cast was the killer, but I'm not gonna lie, I started to grow more and more unsure if that reveal would be satisfying. I loved how the show would slowly reveal more information about Laura, us learning that maybe she wasn't as clean-cut as we were initially thought to think. How surprisingly involved she was with the rest of the townsfolk in a series of shitty situations. But then, they started giving attention to the townsfolk in ways I just did not care about. They set up this dynamic between a guy and his wife who has an eye patch where she's just a fucking nightmare and he desperately wants to leave to be with his high school sweetheart. Then, he walks home to see that she's tried to overdose on pills. because her fucking curtain reeling thing didn't get approved by the patent office, and suddenly she wakes up from a coma thinking that she's still in high school. Then they just run with this. Everyone has to treat this like it's normal as she goes back to school and starts dating a minor. Then they set up this love triangle between our two main teen characters, James and Donna, as he starts to fall for Laura's cousin who comes to town, who is literally just played by Laura's actress. It is a weird show. And stuff like this can be quite funny, which I do believe you're somewhat intended to take this stuff as humorous. At least I hope so. But at a certain point you're like, God, when are they gonna get to the fireworks factory? People who also felt this way were the ABC executives, who demanded that David Lynch and Mark Frost reveal who the killer was once and for all. A question they had known the answer to from the get-go, but, interestingly, never planned on ever revealing. Instead, they'd wanted to use the mystery as a way to continue delving into the lives of these people who were affected by her death. It was never intended to be solved, it was just an excuse to further explore the town. Only issue is, a large chunk of the show's 15 to 20 million viewer base were solely tuning in to find out who killed Laura Palmer. I mean, how could you blame them? And so, in a situation Mark Frost described as having a gun to our head, they were forced into revealing the killer in episode 7 of season 2. And if I'm being honest, I loved it. I only watched the show a few months back, so I haven't had much time to see how fans responded, but I think the reveal, which I won't spoil by the way, is fittingly dark and twisted, while completely altering how you view the show and a lot of these characters. I feel like I'm a pretty tough guy, not much frightens me, except side mice, but I genuinely find myself getting goosebumps and being taken aback at how it was presented. It was an episode so satisfying that immediately after the show saw a massive drop in viewers. They had gotten their answer. The curiosity had been fed. And while ratings were slowly dropping beforehand, mostly due to folks getting sick and never getting any answers to anything, at least 6 million who had dropped off tuned back in to see what happened, in which they all left again. Ratings continued to drop down to as low as 7 million, which was pretty abysmal for an ABC show, especially at the time. Doesn't help that the series saw a massive drop in quality after this, probably in part due to David Lynch and Mark Frost feeling so burned by the network that they chose to limit their involvement from that point onwards. And boy does it show. I must have watched through everything up until the reveal in about a week, yet it has taken me over 2 months to finish that last half season. The show completely loses itself, not fully committing to a Numian plot point for a while. And when it's finally introduced, it's just like a fucking Saturday morning cartoon villain takes over. Laura's killer being revealed was the peak of the series. And even though they didn't want to do it, it is a moment that was so well executed that it subsequently caused a lot of people to lose interest in anything done afterwards. There was just no topping it. Oh boy, time to talk about another ABC show that I for some reason know way too much about. Grey's Anatomy! I've watched 22 seasons of this crap and I really, really like it. Okay, I like those first 10 seasons. Anything after that, I can take or leave. And anything after 15 is straight up trash. But this is ABC's biggest show, with no signs of stopping. Even if all but 3 characters it began with have either left or died. All the show has been left to do for the past decade and a half is continue trying to fill the void by introducing new character after new character, hoping the audience will respond positively to at least one of them. Everyone's fucked everyone, everyone's fucked over everyone, and after like 400 episodes, gets a little tiring, not gonna lie. The show, at one point, starred Meredith Grey, as she and her fellow hospital interns try to prove themselves by balancing their work with the utter exhaustion that comes with being in that kind of setting. Friendships, rivalries, lovers, loss, betrayal. Trust me, it's good for like 10 seasons, which I think is pretty impressive all things considered. But I think the turning point came a little bit before then, coming from one of the biggest moments in the entire show, that being the season 8 finale, Flight. The build up to the episode isn't all that important. You really just need to know that most of the major characters are getting on a flight, only a couple being left behind. And mid-flight, the plane malfunctions and crashes. What the fuck? It becomes this whole life or death ordeal. They wind up stranded in the wilderness. Some characters are relatively okay, while others are crushed. One loses their leg permanently, while 2 of the biggest characters on the show at that point, Meredith's sister Lexi and Mark Sloan, die. They were my 2 favorite characters, so thanks Shonda Rhimes. It's a great episode, all things considered. Super engaging, almost too much as the show would struggle to try and top something at this scale. They have an episode where the hospital gets hacked and held for ransom, and one where they think there's a zombie outbreak. Again, most everything after season 10 sucks. But while on its own it's a fantastic episode, I think it killed the show by telling the audience, any one of these characters you've grown to know and care about over tens of hours of TV can just die in an instant. Gone like that. Now, these two dying, Mark and Lexi, was a result of the actors wanting to move on from the show, so I can't exactly blame the writers for the position they were put in. But from this point on, major characters started dropping like flies. In season 10, Meredith's husband, her love interest from episode 1, is killed off in a situation you can't help but feel could have been avoided. Alex Karev, another major character from the very start, literally leaves out of nowhere in between episodes in the middle of an arc with his girlfriend. Next episode opens to her finding a note that says, "Lol, I got back with a character you haven't seen in like 10 seasons, get wrecked." Meredith starts to take a back seat while the show tries to introduce you to new characters to fill the void. "I have a sister." "I don't like my sister." "I like my sister now." Sister dies. "Wait, I have another sister?" Again, this plane crash episode is only the beginning, because the aftermath of all this only serves to stray the show further and further away from where it began in a narrative sense too. Everyone in the crash decides to sue the hospital and are all rewarded $15 million, which bankrupts the place, and so they all decide to pull their settlements together and buy it. Now the scrappy underdogs are literal millionaires who own the hospital they spent so long trying to rise the ranks of. The what happens after you make it angle does work, and there is interesting stuff done with that in the following seasons, but we're now at a point where the show has gone on with them being millionaires for almost twice as long as they were scrappy surgeons trying to rise the ranks. Makes the early stuff feel so quaint in comparison, something they've just begun trying to recapture by introducing new interns to take some of the spotlight, but with half the time divided between them and the old characters, it results in a show that's currently trying to balance like 30 people. Obviously, you wouldn't want Meredith being an underdog into her 50s, that would be depressing. But I think that's the issue with your show going on for like 23 seasons. Not to mention, her life as a whole is just getting increasingly more depressing. Her mom dies, her dad slaps her across the face, finds out she has a sister, she dies, her dad dies, all her closest friends have either died or moved on to better things. Her husband dies, she's stuck with all these fucking rejects. There are too many characters who have married, then divorced, then remarried, had a kid, gotten divorced again, find a new relationship while trying to raise their kid as a single parent. It is fucking miserable. But it's the life of a soap opera character. As long as there's more episodes to deliver, there's gotta be more conflict to keep it interesting. But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, there is no character here at all that I envy. And again, it all comes from these shows delivering such a massive moment that can never be topped. They at least had those defining moments that marked their end. How about the shows that just fizzle out? That continue going on forever and ever with no end in sight? Choosing one episode that killed it seems impossible, right? Well, I can try. Family Guy, no stranger to being talked about on my channel. Most look at Life of Brian as the point in which the series died, taking a beloved character and murdering them in the most schmaltzy way possible, only to bring them back unceremoniously 2 episodes later. But I'd argue that didn't truly mark the downfall of the show. It's a bad episode, don't get me wrong, but to me, and this may be an odd one, I think the episode that definitively showed Family Guy's incapability of recapturing the magic it once had came from Road to India. Now, most of you out there probably couldn't even tell me a thing that happens in this one, and that's exactly my point. Starring Brian and Stewie, Family Guy's Road To's used to be landmark moments in the show, at least one of them frequently appearing in everyone's top 20 list. While the first 2 decided to stick with a slightly more emotional core, like the first seeing Brian drag Stewie on a trip to his unknowingly deceased mother, and the second having Stewie try and run away to England to live in a kid show he doesn't realize is fake. But they quickly began leaning more into silly adventures like Road to Germany, Road to Vegas, or perhaps the most famous Road to the Multiverse, which saw Brian and Stewie get stuck traveling through an infinite number of dimensions while trying to find their way home. It is such a good episode, one I can't believe is only 22 minutes. There is so much packed in here, they just give it their all. Even somewhat lesser Road 2s, such as Road to Rupert or Road to Vegas, still have a lot worth appreciating. Road to Rupert has that amazing Gene Kelly sequence, and I still love the framing around Road to Vegas, where Stewie unknowingly creates clones of himself and Brian, one pair having extremely good luck, and the other having extremely bad, which leads to situations that result in one out of both pairs dying. Really cool idea, fun presentation too. Well, for 3 long seasons, that was the last attempt at a Road to, before we saw its return in season 14 with Road to India, which is by far the worst and least interesting one out of the lot. It sees Brian fall in love with a tech support representative and takes Stewie with him to India to find her. It's just lame. The stakes have never been lower, as the show covers every boring, tired, stereotypical Indian joke ever. Boy, India sure is dirty. Those Bollywood numbers are weird. Pair that with a stupid-ass B-plot where Peter takes over Joe's spot as captain at his bingo night, and what you're left with is a road to In Name Alone.
Well, I came across the world for a very special girl.
That is the one funny moment. There is nothing here reminiscent of the previous specials aside from it indeed featuring Brian and Stewie. All those episodes had such a grand feel. I mean, there's not even a song other than a very brief one to close things out. It jumps from random gag to random gag. He finds the girl but needs to raise enough money for her father to approve. He goes on a game show, loses, the problem fixes itself, but she decides not to be with him because he doesn't know enough about Indian culture. Like, of course not. It's your average modern Family Guy episode, phoning it in. But at least those don't have the balls to make themselves a part of a beloved set of episodes that actually tried to be something more grand. Road to India is the perfect example of why Family Guy just lost what made it so good. And I don't mean in comparison to those first 3 seasons, I mean like those first 10 to 12. Sure, they weren't all stellar, but they felt distinctly Family Guy, even the bad ones. And in my opinion, a similar case of this can be seen with SpongeBob. Now, when SpongeBob got bad is a very touchy subject in that community, probably a result of how aggressive its detractors were a decade ago. It used to be pretty commonly accepted that the first 3 seasons were the only good ones. Now for a lot it shifted to include season 4, some would argue there's okay parts of 5. Not many defending 6 or 7 now. Either way, similarly to Family Guy, even in those bad episodes in seasons 6, 7, and 8, no matter the quality, they all still felt like SpongeBob, just not a very good version of it. But after the second movie, things started to change. It was shortly after the release of the second film when a big shift happened in the way the show was made. That being, instead of being board-driven, it became script-driven. That means instead of the artists being given a loose outline of the plot and then letting the storyboarders decide how the action and dialogue would flow, they now start by writing a detailed script of the entire thing, which the storyboard artists then have to simply visualize. There's merit to both approaches, but I don't think there's any arguing that it creates a vastly different feel. Like, watch any early Season 9 episode, and then a later Season 9 episode, the change in production happening somewhere in the middle. And you'll notice that the show is just different, fundamentally. Much less story and character-driven, focusing way more on the gags and cartoony antics. And while I personally don't get much out of these newer episodes, I do have to acknowledge that there is a sizable fandom out there for new SpongeBob. And that's great. But I have to say, I'm really not a fan of how much they use the older episodes as a crutch, reusing ideas from those first 1 to 3 seasons in place of coming up with their own story. I know SpongeBob fans are sick of hearing about this, so if it bothers you that much, feel free to skip ahead or leave, because I'm probably not going to say anything that others haven't already pointed out. But the earlier seasons, up until 9 I'd say, did a pretty good job at making each and every episode feel distinct. I think the most you could point to was the various Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes, but even then, each of them did their own thing entirely. And while I don't envy the writers having to come up with new ideas for a show that's gone on this long, it does get a little tiring seeing how much the series now relies on running gags and referencing its past. This comes in the form of sequel episodes. You got Bubble Buddy Returns, Doodle Dimension, Bubble Time, The Salty Sponge, Squidiot Box, PL1413, Curse of the Weredoodle. These are real, some of these genuinely sound fake. All episodes that are not copying what came before. Don't get me wrong, these episodes do something different, but they're all bringing back something that remained a one and done for well over a decade, and it's hard not to feel like they're retreading on old ground. I mean, that's not to even mention how much they now reuse one-off characters like Nosferatu. Again, a character who before season 11 only ever appeared once, but in the last 5 seasons, he has returned 12 times. And that's just in the main series. He's also appeared in both spin-offs a total of 20 times so far. It's kinda lame. I think the episode to me that really exemplifies everything I don't personally like about new SpongeBob, overly long, drawn-out gags, at times weird timing on the animation, and bringing back an old plot point only to do nothing with it, is Doodle Dimension. It's like the mindset is more equals good. SpongeBob and Patrick get transported to a Doodlebob dimension, where they can create Doodlebob again. And a Doodle Gary, a Doodle Squidward, a Doodle Mr. Krabs, a Doodle Sandy, and it just seems like using the skin of an old episode while not really understanding why it was so iconic in the first place. You know, it's got creative elements, some neat bits of animation. It's not bad. But to me, it's just kinda nothing. The Doodle Bob episode is so funny to me because SpongeBob is being terrorized by his exact opposite. This weird creature he created that just seeks violence. Whereas Doodle Dimension, while having some creative sequences, just has little substance to me. There's little reason to ever want to rewatch it. And honestly, this is one of the better case scenarios for a sequel episode. You have others like Squiddiot Box, which completely fails to understand the entire point of the original. With SpongeBob's imagination box breaking and them needing to go buy a new one. Like, fucking, there was nothing special about the box. Squidward gave them the box. It was all about what SpongeBob and Patrick chose to do with it. It was all in their heads. That's the whole fucking point. I feel stupid even having to point that out. I think I'll just never agree with SpongeBob fans on these new seasons, and that's okay. There are people who like new SpongeBob, new Family Guy, new Grey's Anatomy, the Madman, or Mad Women in most cases. So for the sake of it, I'll reiterate. This is just my list. If you disagree, then let me know. Drop your own episodes you think mark the shift below, because to me, the sequel SpongeBob episodes just showcase a series that comes off like a parody of itself. Rick and Morty has also gotten to a point where it feels like a bizarre imitation of what it once was. And while every now and then they can still pump out a great episode, I think the one that many diehard fans called it quits on was Season 5's Rick-dependent spray. Typically, Pickle Rick is the moment used to signify its death, and while that is an incredibly mediocre episode that has a complete outsider explain Rick's character to the audience in the least subtle way possible, leaving no room for interpretation, I don't think it would have been talked about nearly as much if it weren't for the Pickle Rick meme taking off and ruining its reputation. To me, Rick-dependent spray highlights that the show has just lost any kind of balance when it came to its edge. Say what you want about Justin Roiland or Dan Harmon, there are plenty things to not like about them. But they understood the show better than anyone, and so when new writers were brought in and their involvement got lessened more and more, you could definitely feel an effort on the new guys' part to try and replicate the unique humor the show was beloved for. Justin Roiland's humor more so. I'm aware Dan Harmon still has a very small involvement in current episodes. It was a weird show that would tackle a lot of iconic sci-fi tropes, but it stood out with the absurdity of the improvisational feel it had. A lot of lines only really hitting as hard as they did as a result of Justin's delivery, whether or not it made complete sense. If it made them laugh in the moment, it got put in the episode and it showed. By season 5, the series had long passed its prime after a promising third season was completely ruined through a series of misses. In its first 2 seasons, Rick and Morty would hit you with banger after banger, and so a bad episode stood out, never mind a bad season. And with Justin taking a bigger step back to focus on his other show, Solar Opposites, basically only returning to voice the 2 leads when it was needed, and then, later taking a permanent step back, you could see the newer writers desperately trying to capture the weird dark humor that made the show so big, and it never really worked as well. Season 4, after scaling back the scope and serialization, was a slight improvement over 3, but certainly didn't live up to the hype of those first 2. When there was a good episode, it was a good episode, but when they missed, fuck did they drive off the face of a cliff. In a way that makes me question how nobody stepped in during the production of some of these to ask, hey, is this actually funny? And because of that lack of self-awareness, we wind up getting episodes like Season 5's Rick-dependent spray, which sees Rick use a barrel of horse semen in an experiment he's conducting to try and make a weapon to use against a race of horse people, but uh-oh, he doesn't know that Morty came inside that horse semen. The charm of Rick and Morty came from most episodes being able to boil themselves down to a standard sitcom plot. Morty's parents want him to stop missing school, he wants a girl to like him, and then we see that contrast with whatever sci-fi trope Rick throws into the mix. Morty is missing school because his grandfather keeps taking him on these insane missions that completely traumatize him, or Morty uses a love potion on the girl he likes. And then we see things escalate and resolve through increasingly absurd means that flip these tropes on their head. Rick tricks Morty's parents into believing these adventures are actually making him smarter, while manically telling him this train is not stopping. Or a flu causes the love potion to spread to everyone in the world, the 2's attempts at fixing things only making things worse, ending with them having to abandon this world they've completely destroyed. Not every episode was that standard, but generally, you start small and gradually have things escalate in a way only this show could accomplish. However, this one, opening on Morty jerking off, giant mutant sperm now attacking the town, it already starts at 11, and so the only thing you can do is continue pushing things further. The sperm queen starts using Morty to create more, and so they figured the only way they can resolve things is to lure the sperm to a giant human egg that they get from Morty's sister. This show's obsession with is a whole other topic I've already made a video on, go watch that. After this, we end the episode with the egg being fertilized and Morty and Summer now having a giant insect baby floating through space. Like, you can be as weird as you want, but if it's not funny, then all you're left with is an episode that's uncomfortable. It would have been fine if the show were able to acknowledge this and move on, act like it never happened, but no, the baby appears at least one more time later in the season, and is mentioned next season. Guess it was just that funny to these guys. This was widely considered to be the worst episode of the show when it aired, so isn't it crazy to consider there are now episodes people consider worse? But either way, after this season, I think the crew realized they couldn't recapture what Justin brought to the show, and from that point on, it's taken a slightly different approach. The series now doing more of its own thing and sticking to that, rather than desperately trying to remind folks of when it was something special. And I think that was the best move. And the series does still have a smaller but incredibly dedicated fan base, so I'm happy they at least course-corrected before things got more fetishy. Other shows have much less extreme cases of drop-off points, or at the very least, much easier to point to. A show like Friends went on for 236 episodes with the most basic plots imaginable. This was mainly done through the various relationships the characters go through with others, and even within their own group. Of course, the main two are Ross and Rachel and Chandler and Monica, but I think other than Joey and Monica, every character in this cast has kissed every other character at some point in the show. And two of them are siblings. Why is this the segment? And while a lot of these relationships made sense at the very least, I think the one that most fans agree on going too far is the time Joey and Rachel got together. The pairing folks fought for most was obviously Ross and Rachel. Of course, they're the ones people want to see end up together despite their many trials and tribulations. But during one of their breakups, while Rachel is pregnant with Ross's baby, and despite no implications of this for the first 7 seasons, Joey suddenly develops feelings for her. And while it does take until season 9, they do eventually get together, most fans finding this to be an utterly bizarre pairing that not only took away from the will-they, won't-they nature of Ross and Rachel's dynamic, but couldn't convince viewers this was a natural pairing. It felt forced for the sake of something new to do. But their chemistry just did not translate from friend to romantic partner the same way that Ross and Rachel did, making fans hate it more. And because they eventually break up in season 10 after realizing they are not meant for each other, it leaves this period of the series feeling so strange in retrospect, and like the writers were just trying to do whatever they could to make the series interesting this late in. The Office too, Steve Carell departing from his role as Michael Scott in season 7, being replaced briefly by Will Ferrell. A very funny actor, sure, but with a show so reliant on the strong dynamics between the cast, dropping someone new in place of the show's flagship character, especially with an actor as recognizable as Will Ferrell, just seemed odd and unnatural. Will Ferrell works best when he's allowed to be loud and silly and absurd, but that kind of character can make viewers feel like the show isn't taking the time to let fans adjust to the series without its main character, almost like they're trying to move on as quickly as possible with no easing period. It wasn't entirely heated, he was clearly a temporary replacement, so I can see why the writers would have assumed it would work. You know, he is the mark of that transitional period, but in execution, a lot felt as if it was too jarring of a shift, especially so late into the show. As you probably noticed throughout this video, this is a very broad subject. With most of these shows having over 100 episodes, there are probably at least a dozen that different folks point to when it comes to claiming which killed it. But again, that's not really the point. Because I think what is clear is that a show's death typically comes from the relationship it has with the audience. A show's death usually comes from the moment it either fails to commit to its own evolution, sometimes that can come from a creative gamble that doesn't land, an important character being removed, rewritten, or replaced. Or it can even be an episode that's perfectly fine, maybe even clever on its own, but makes it clear the show is no longer aiming for the same target it once was in its prime. That's probably why these death episodes are so inconsistent across each show's fandom, because what's breaking is the expectation, the belief that no matter how much things evolve, there is still a core to the series that will eventually be paid off or returned to in some way that's satisfying. But long-running TV very rarely works like that. Writers change, networks intervene, and the show stretches beyond its original shape. I don't envy any showrunner from any series I've brought up today, having to deal with the constant struggle between what a show was, what it is now, and what folks hope it might someday become. The real truth is no show dies within a single episode. They just reach a point where you can finally see the machinery behind them. You stop watching a world that feels alive and start watching a production that, no matter what, has to keep going. Once you see that, you can't really unsee it. But whether or not that ruins the series or just changes how you look at it, is up to you. I mean, just be glad you're not a fan of the show Roseanne. Went on for 8 seasons, ending with her husband having a heart attack. Season 9 starts with him back like nothing happened. Then the show ends by revealing that he did die after his heart attack, and the entire final season was merely a book that Roseanne had been writing to cope with the death of her husband. And then the show was revived in 2018, and they immediately tell you to ignore that ending. He didn't die. He survived his heart attack. Season 9 isn't canon. Fuck you!